For today's social studies lesson, we're going to be reading a Scholastic News article. The title of today's article is The History of Gingerbread. So have any of you made a gingerbread house before, either at school or maybe at home or at a friend's house? So I know that in my classroom, we have made gingerbread houses in the past. So some of you might be familiar with how to make a gingerbread house, but we're going to learn a little bit about the history of gingerbread. But before we get started, we're going to look at some vocabulary words. Our first vocabulary word is ginger. So ginger is a spice that comes from the root of the ginger plant. So it is a spice that comes from the root of the ginger plant. Our second word is edible. Edible means safe to eat. The flowers on this cake are edible. They are made of icing. So edible means that you can eat it. It is safe for you to eat. And our last vocabulary word is scrumptious. When something is scrumptious, it tastes really delicious. So scrumptious is an adjective, so it's a word that we use to describe, and we could say that something is scrumptious when it tastes really, really good. All right, so if we look at the front cover of our Scholastic News, it says, in the wintertime, many people like to eat gingerbread cookies. Where did this spicy and sweet treat get its start? 1,000 years of gingerbread. So as we read today, I want you guys to be thinking about all the things that people have made with gingerbread over the years. Imagine biting into a warm gingerbread cookie. The spices warm your throat and make your tongue tingle. Gingerbread is a delicious winter treat, and it's been around for a long time. What is gingerbread? Gingerbread can be a soft, moist bread or a hard, crunchy cookie, but all gingerbread is sweet and spicy. The sweetness comes from molasses or honey. The spiciness comes from ginger. We get ginger from the root of the ginger plant. So we did talk about ginger. That was one of our vocabulary words, and it is a spice that comes from the root of the ginger plant. But we also learned that in gingerbread, um, the spiciness comes from the ginger. So gingerbread, no matter if it's something that's soft and moist like a bread or hard and crunchy like a cookie, all gingerbread is sweet and spicy. And the spicy comes from the ginger and the sweet comes from the honey or the molasses. Gingerbread cookies. About 1,000 years ago, bakers in Europe started making gingerbread cookies. They made the cookies into different shapes. In spring, you could find gingerbread flowers. In autumn, you could find gingerbread animals. Some cookies were decorated with edible gold. You could eat it. So, about 1,000 years ago in Europe, bakers made cookies in different kinds of shapes. So, depending on the season, sometimes in spring they were making flowered gingerbread, or in the autumn or fall they were making gingerbread made out of animals. Gingerbread men. A few hundred years later, Queen Elizabeth the First of England had an idea for a new kind of cookie. In her palace she had royal gingerbread makers. Baking gingerbread was their only job. They baked cookies that looked like the Queen's friends and other world leaders. When people visited, the Queen gave them cookies that looked like them. Many people say that Queen Elizabeth invented gingerbread men. So, a few hundred years after the gingerbread cookies that were the flowers and the animals, um, in England, Queen Elizabeth actually had people who made gingerbread men, and they would make these cookies that looked like people that were coming to visit her, so her friends or other world leaders. So that is where gingerbread men came from. So we had gingerbread cookies, gingerbread men, and now we're going to talk about gingerbread houses. So at the same time, bakers in Germany started making gingerbread houses. The bakers may have gotten the idea from an old German story. The story about a witch who lived in a house made of gingerbread and candy. In the 1800s, the Grimm brothers wrote a new version of the story and called it Hansel and Gretel. The story became very popular, and so did gingerbread houses. You can still find gingerbread men and houses today. You can also find funny cookies like gingerbread fidget spinners. The shapes may have changed over the past 1,000 years, but the taste is the same. Gingerbread is still a scrumptious treat to enjoy on a cold winter's day. So, gingerbread houses came from bakers in Germany. So, bakers in Germany started making gingerbread houses, and they got the idea from an old German story. And that story is very similar. The new version of that story is called Hansel and Gretel, and some of you may have heard of that story before. So the bakers in Germany got the idea to make gingerbread houses from an old German story. So whether or not you're making gingerbread cookies that look like animals and flowers, if you're making gingerbread men or gingerbread houses, all of those sweet, spicy treats are scrumptious, and like I said, they taste either sweet, they taste both sweet and spicy. So lastly, let's look at cookies for all seasons. So long ago, bakers made different gingerbread cookies for different seasons. And we had kind of touched on this when we were talking about gingerbread cookies earlier in that section. So we talked about flowers for spring, and this is an example of what the flowers looked like. And we also talked about animals for autumn, and this is what the animals that they would make look like. So what kind of cookie would you make for winter? What one would you make for summer? So think about it for yourself. If you could be designing your own cookie, what would your cookie look like in the summer? And what would your cookie look like in the winter? So we're going to stop here. You guys are going to move on to the next slide and answer some questions from today's reading.